The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matthew Darius. I work for New York ASBO. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today we have Dr. Eric Knuschik from Stanford University. He'll be speaking to us on can incentives be integrated into school decision-making. Now, a couple points of order before we get started. You can ask questions during this webinar. You are muted by default. In order to ask a question, you have to have entered your audio PIN. Your audio PIN is located in the control panel that pops up when you logged on under the audio title. Now, you have to have that typed in to be able to ask a question. To ask a question, there is a button also on that panel called Raise Your Hand. If you have a question at any time during the webinar or during the Q&A, hit that. That notifies me of a question, puts you into a queue, and then Dr. Knuschik and I will answer your questions from there. And with that out of the way, Doc, it's all yours.
Thanks very much. This is Rick Hanushek. I'm sitting out in Stanford, California right now, and I'm going to run through a few ideas that I've developed, and I hope that they're useful for you. I'm a researcher that has tried to look at how you finance schools and how you get the most performance out of schools. For a long time, nobody paid any attention to me because schools could get as much money as they wanted, largely, or not quite as much as wanted. But there were no real tough decisions that were being made. Recently, with the 2008 recession and with a variety of other problems that states have faced, the idea of paying more attention to how you spend your funds has become more popular, or at least one that people are willing to entertain. And what I wanted to do today, if hopefully it's useful, to go through some of the research evidence and some of the motivation for what's happening around us, and then get into, at a level of financing, what kinds of decisions and incentives might be used, and how decisions might be made better to make use of the funds that are available. So I'm going to go through a PowerPoint presentation to encapsulate some of the basic ideas, but I encourage you, even as the presentation is going on, if you have a question, raise your hand, and Matthew will put you in touch with me, and we can handle your questions as we go along. So with that, let me begin. The overview of the discussion here is that I wanted to start just by talking about what I see as the problem as a researcher in this area. I'm an economist by training and have spent a lot of time looking at both how finances relate to performance in schools and the importance of schools to our society. And I wanted to quickly go over that because I think that that better frames the discussion of what kinds of decisions you people have to make regularly and why everybody is looking over your shoulder and trying to get the best decisions possible. Quickly talk about goals, which I don't think needs much time because you're well into what the goals are. But I then talk a little bit about what, from a research standpoint, we see as the main leverage points on improving the performance of our schools and for making effective use of funds. Talk a little bit about the difficulties in achieving these goals. And then talk about what is presaged by the title of the talk, how do we contrast making decisions essentially by incentives in the system versus regulatory responses. And a little bit about the idea of continuous improvement as a way to move forward as we go on. So those are the overall topics. Let me just run through the first parts on the problems and the goals very quickly, but to set it in the framework that I think is important for decision makers at all levels to think about. The easiest picture is one of what has happened to resources. This is aggregate data for the whole U.S., but tracing out resources in the schools from 1960 till 2009. And what you see if you go down the rows of this, pupil-teacher ratios have consistently gone down, fallen by about a third since 1960. Teachers with master's degrees have dramatically increased over time. The 2009 data aren't available, but it's somewhere between around 55% as best we can tell. Similarly, with median years of teacher experience, we see that we've been moving toward the most experienced labor force in teaching since basically World War II. And the first three rows are important because since master's degrees and teacher experience largely determine average salary levels in districts, and pupil-teacher ratios tell you how many students you spread these salaries across, you get to the bottom row, which is expenditures per student. These are all adjusted to 2008, 2009 dollars. And what we see is that expenditures per student were $2,500 in 1960, and they've quadrupled by the time we get to 2009. So that overall we've got a lot more money in schools and used the way many educators would say they should be used to get experience and more education of the teachers and smaller class sizes. Now the unfortunate part that goes along with that is that if we trace out performance of students, these are National Assessment of Education Progress scores for 17-year-olds from when we started in basically 1970 till today. The top red line is math scores, and the blue line with triangles is reading scores. And what you see by this is that we are almost identical in terms of student performance in 2009 to where we were in 1970. So we've quadrupled funding, and yet student performance is almost identical. Now you could argue that this overstates lots of things because in fact the student population is more difficult to educate, and this doesn't reflect all kinds of other forces on students. But yet, if we're talking about quadrupling funds, even if you take out funding for special education or whatever, you find that there's been a dramatic increase in the funds available, and it hasn't yielded the outcomes that we would want. So we can also see, if we go, here's a slightly different version of the same idea. With a couple of colleagues of mine, Paul Peterson at Harvard and Ludger Wussmann in Munich, we tried to look at which states across the nation have increased the most in terms of student performance. And this is largely looking at gains in NAEP performance, or National Assessment of Educational Progress performance, across reading, math, and science. This is looking at all the scores available, but these will be 4th and 8th grade scores because there aren't 17-year-old or high school scores available by state. But what we've done here on the vertical axis is how much gain has there been annually in performance. And along the horizontal axis is how much more per student was spent in each of the states. And what you see, there's this line that actually connects to New York at one end and runs through Alabama. But the important thing about this is, first, that it's pretty flat. It's almost a horizontal line, saying that it doesn't matter how much was spent in terms of performance gains. But that as we look across the states of the Union, it's just a cloud, that some states have spent virtually nothing more in real dollars than they did in 1990 and have gotten very rapid gains, like you can look at Florida up in the top left-hand corner, or Delaware or Maryland or Massachusetts along the top, which have gotten the fastest gains. But the fastest gaining states, some have spent a lot, like Massachusetts, and some have spent little, like Florida. And it doesn't appear that it's the funding per se that's driving this. It appears that it's much more how the funds have been spent. You also see down at the bottom, you've got other states like Maine that's increased its spending by $4,000 per student per year over this period, and is got very little change in performance of its students. So this is the one part of the story that in the aggregate we have not seen the kinds of gains that we would want. Now, what I wanted to do is say something about the importance of this, though, before we go on, and that is that by all the evidence we have, it makes a huge difference to the nation to do well on these tests. Some people say, well, these tests don't mean anything. Who cares about NAEP, or who cares about the New York State test and so forth? These aren't really important. People are just, doing simple problems on these tests. The answer that we get when we look across nations is that that's entirely wrong. And to give you some idea of this, let me go to the implications of, oops, wrong way, sorry, of what would happen if on international tests we improved our performance. It turns out that the United States, if you give international math and science tests across all of the developed countries and developing countries, the United States is below average, below the developing country average, so that most of Europe, in fact, performs better than the U.S. There's only a few places like Greece and Portugal that are performing worse than we are. And from what you know of their economies, you might suspect that everything is a mess in those countries. But as you look across the other parts of Europe, you see they're doing much better than we are. So what I have here is a simple chart that says, what if the future economic growth of the U.S. followed the pattern that we'd seen for the last half century, for the last 50 years? According to that pattern, there's and if we look across countries, there's a very close relationship between performance on these tests and economic growth. And if you look at the first row of this table, it says, what would happen if we increased by 1/4 of a standard deviation on these tests, which are benchmarks internationally? But what it really means is if we got up to our students were performing at the level of roughly the students in Germany, or half the difference between us and Canada. Canada, it turns out, outperforms us by a fair amount. The present value of that, summed of the added growth, added additions to GDP over the next 80 years, which is the lifetime of somebody born today, would be $40 trillion. Now, even though all of you, in fact, spend your time looking at numbers like $40 trillion have little meaning, but that's 268% of current GDP. We have roughly a $16 trillion economy right now. And so that would mean, one way of thinking about this is that over the next year, next 80 years, every working person would have his or her salary increased by 12% on average each year, every paycheck. So it's a huge amount. And if you go down, you get to other numbers like Finland, which is currently near the top of the international test, is worth, getting to that level is worth $103 trillion in present value, or something approaching 7 times our current GDP. The bottom line, it says, talks about eliminating below level 1. This is really NCLB. This is getting everybody up to a minimal level by these international tests. And that is also worth an enormous amount, $72 trillion. So all I want to do is say here very simply that improving the performance of our students is worth an enormous amount to the country and to every individual in the country. And so that's the importance and goals. In terms of goals, I don't have to spend any time on this. We'd all like higher achievement for our students. We'd like resources to be used better so that the 4-fold increase in our spending per pupil turns into higher achievement. And we, throughout the nation, have concerns about equity and the reduction of achievement gaps that we see that are huge. The difference between nationally, the average black student in the U.S. is learning at roughly the 20th percentile of the white distribution of students. So we have these enormous challenges facing us. And the question is, well, how can we deal with them? When I look at this from a researcher, I get one answer. The place where all of the policy leverage comes is in terms of teacher effectiveness. The difference between good and bad teachers is, in fact, enormous by all of the studies we've done. We've got a number of studies, some of which are in New York City, others of which are from throughout the nation. I've myself done some work in Texas and in Illinois. In these places, we see that the difference between good and bad teachers in terms of student achievement is dramatic. In one study that I did, for example, if we looked in Gary, Indiana, and we looked at the difference between a top and a bottom teacher, or a good and a poor teacher in Gary, the top teachers were getting learning gains of 1.5 years of achievement for each academic year. The teachers at the bottom end of the scale were getting learning gains of half of a year of achievement for each academic year. So that in a single academic year, depending upon what particular classroom a kid went into, the difference in learning on average could be as much as 1 full year of knowledge in an academic year. Or in other studies, if you look at the impact of good teachers versus average teacher, the answer is that if you have a good teacher somewhere around the 84th percentile of teaching versus an average teacher, you find that 3 to 5 years in a row of a good teacher is sufficient to completely erase the gaps by socioeconomic status, the difference in achievement on average between kids on free and reduced price lunch and those that aren't. So that there is a huge amount of leverage that's available in terms of teacher effectiveness. The question is, how do you ensure that? And this is the puzzle that's being discussed in lots of places. Let me talk about here a little bit in a different framework about, from the studies we have, of how good teachers impact on the future learnings, future earnings of kids in their class. So this says, let's take a teacher, if you look at the graph on the screen now, the bottom dashed line says, let's look at a teacher who's in the 60th percentile, and let's figure out the impact on the lifetime earnings of that teacher who is going to increase achievement above the average teacher. The average teacher, the median teacher, is at the 0 line on this graph. And what it does is plot out the total effect of the teacher, which clearly depends upon class size. If you have a good teacher with lots of kids, that good teacher has a huge impact because there's more kids to deal with. If the good teacher only teaches 5 kids, there's a smaller impact because that teacher isn't reaching so many. So look at the middle dashed line, which is the 75th percentile teacher in this graph. If I look from the, and these calculations come from how much added learning would we expect from a 75th percentile teacher on the kids in a class, taking into account that kids don't always remember and retain everything they're taught. They lose some of that. But some of that added achievement comes with them when they go into the labor market. And then we just look at what that means for their added earnings from studies of how achievement affects earnings. And if I look at that dashed line for the 75th percentile teacher and look at a class of 30 kids, the answer is that each year that 75th percentile teacher is adding $430,000 worth of lifetime income, present value terms again, to the kids in her class, compared to just an average teacher. So there's a huge impact of good teachers on the future earnings. Now, the unfortunate part is that there's a bottom half to this graph. If I look at teachers now in red that are below average, 40th percentile, 25th percentile, 10th percentile, we see that they're subtracting from lifetime earnings of their children compared to an average teacher. And you get some huge numbers. If I looked at the 10th percentile teacher, which is the teacher that none of us really want to have our kids with, that teacher compared to an average teacher is subtracting $800,000 from the future lifetime earnings of her class of 30 kids. So the simple story is that the quality and the impact of teachers is important for the nation as a whole because it affects how our nation grows, and it is extraordinarily important for the kids that are in particular classes in terms of their lifetime opportunities. So I've focused on teachers. I'm going to identify non-personnel kinds of expenditures, which are things that you people regularly deal with. This is an area that I'm not going to spend much time on today because, frankly, I don't know as much about it as you do or others do. But what I would point out, and there's some data becoming available through the Council on Great City Schools that talks about just how much variation there is in all kinds of non-personnel expenditures across districts. I bring that up because it's something that you might want to look at to get some benchmarks of how your districts are doing and what possibilities there are, because these differences in per pupil expenditures that have been developed by the Council of Great City Schools are just huge, and you're talking about the possibility of finding resources there that can be used in effective ways for ensuring that we have the top teachers in all of our classrooms. So that's along the side. I'm not going to talk about that. Let me talk a little bit about overall policies and then be a little bit more specific, and then we can get to questions that you might have. So the difficulties in improving teacher quality, I suspect are obvious to you, but let me give you some of the research basis that goes beyond that. People have tried for a very long period of time to figure out just what makes a good teacher. And so they've looked at the training that the teachers got in their undergraduate pre-service training. They've looked at professional development. They've looked at the amount of experience that teachers have, whether they have master's degrees, whether they're fully certified by state rules, and so forth. And the answer has been surprising to some, to many. There is no systematic relationship between any of those things I just mentioned and student achievement or student achievement gains. The only possible exception to that is that we know that teachers in their first year or two are not completely seasoned and don't do as good a job as they will eventually. So there's a little bit of gain in the first couple of years of experience. But the evidence suggests that after that, a fifth-year teacher is just as effective as a 25th-year teacher on average. There's variations in all of these, and some people go up and down a little bit. But on average, experience and graduate degrees and so forth, the things that we pay for regularly in terms of salaries, are not closely related to effectiveness. Now, the reason for bringing these up, or one of the main reasons, is that, in fact, if we don't know what leads to a teacher being effective in the classroom or ineffective, it's really hard to develop regulations that guarantee that we have good teachers in the classroom. The regulatory route just breaks down if we don't have knowledge about what leads to effectiveness. So that leads to the title of this webinar, in part, is how do we get incentives into the system? The idea behind incentives is pretty simple. It says reward people that are doing the things you want them to do, and don't reward them, or maybe even punish them if they're doing things you don't want them to do. So in terms of teachers, it amounts to rewarding teachers that are effective and not rewarding those that are ineffective. Or making overall decisions, the same apply. Now, when we look at this overall and sort of the macro view, and you have to remember that I live in Stanford, California, which is one jurisdiction over from Mountain View, California, which is the home of Google. And so I'm starting out with rather the Google Earth view of the world, where I'm far away, and I'll hope to get down a little bit closer to land soon. But in terms of the overall view, the things that we found both from study of U.S. schools and from international studies is that certain sets of overall incentives in institutions are really important. The first one that has made quite a difference in a variety of places is having a clear accountability system where you in fact trace students over time. Now, obviously NCLB has gotten a bad reputation, some deserved, some not deserved, for measuring student performance. But frankly, having those data available on where students are learning and where they aren't is extraordinarily important, because it in part links into what I think is another answer, and this comes right down to your home here and the kinds of decisions that you're making. there's a lot of evidence that suggests that with an accountability system which says we know what you're doing, then you ought to let local decision makers have wide latitude in the decisions they're making, because it's the local decision makers that know both capacity and needs. And so overall, it makes sense, particularly when you have a good accountability system, to allow many of the decisions, more of the decisions, to devolve not only to the districts but also to the local school. Thirdly, in terms of the international evidence we have, is that performance pay does in fact matter. And let me take just 1 second or a few minutes to talk about performance pay, because it's been a controversial issue that's been in the news and discussed a lot. By performance pay, I would include 2 elements, frankly. One is that you reward those who are doing a good job. You reward those at the top end of the scale, because you want to try to keep them in the system. But secondly, at the bottom end, I think performance pay in my mind includes also the possibility that you don't continue people at the bottom, what I would call the zero pay option, where people who are proven ineffective are sent on to other jobs. Now, there's been a recent study that particularly the teachers' unions like to quote, where there was an experiment done in Nashville, Tennessee by Vanderbilt University, where they selected a set of schools, and in some schools offered bonuses for student performance gains, and in other schools did not offer any bonuses. After they had run the system for, I think it's 2, maybe 3 years, they looked at to see whether students learned more in the schools that had the performance pay versus those that didn't, and they found no difference. They found that on average, these schools were getting the same achievement. I think this is not the evidence that we want. The reason why this is not the evidence is that it only looked at existing teachers in the schools and existing teachers that stayed in the schools throughout the experiment. So that the experiment was really, if I dangle a carrot in front of teachers, will they work harder or work better? And the answer was no. But that, you can put it within your own frame of reference, but to me, I would have expected something very similar to that, because when I go around to different schools, I am quite convinced that most teachers are really doing their best job. They're working as hard as they can, and they're not going to work harder for the possibility of a little bit of extra funding. But performance pay has a second element to it, and that is it attracts a different set of people into the schools. First, it tries to reward the teachers you know that are effective by giving them more money to try to keep them in the system so that they don't become part of the teacher churn. But secondly, it also is used to look at the retention end. There are certain teachers that after you see them for 2 or 3 years, which is within your probationary period, you recognize that they're not doing a good job, and using the zero option or moving people on, I think, is very important. And the available evidence suggests that that has a huge impact on student performance. We can come back if you have questions on that and the evidence behind that. Internationally, by the way, countries that have more performance pay tend to get higher achievement on international math and science tests, other things being equal. And then finally, the controversial element that and I'm sure you face with charter schools is providing more school choice, in fact, is one way to try to set up better incentives for the traditional public schools, on the argument that if you're losing students, you try harder and try to figure out how do you keep them by improving the quality of your product. All of these are things that at the sort of more macro level have proven to be positive forces on both getting higher achievement and on getting higher achievement for any amount that's being spent. In other words, improving the efficiency by holding constant what is being spent, getting higher achievement. From your standpoint, though, I might emphasize sort of more micro considerations. Recently, people have thought a lot about the possibility of what we call continuous improvement. And I think that this, frankly, holds the most hope for future improvement. The idea is the following, that as you go along, it's hard to know exactly what's going to work in a particular school system with the particular people and students you have. You're bombarded with a lot of ideas about new programs or new way of doing business that might work. In reality, the evidence suggests that very few things could be uniformly applied across all of your districts. In fact, some programs and some ideas will work in one district but completely fail in another district. The idea is to try to use it to evaluate things as we go along. If you have in place a strong data system that can link programs and people to student achievement, and in particular student achievement gains for individual students, you have in place a way of checking whether the ideas that maybe the local teachers college told you would work, whether they do in fact work in your district, or whether the new program works. But in order to get information along the way on programs, and here's where I think you can have an enormous impact on your schools, think about how you introduce programs. In particular, if you have a new, say, after-school program that you want to try out and see if that helps to deal with low-income kids that don't have any place to go after school but might provide some extra instruction. If you just put that into all of the schools in your district, it's virtually impossible to ever figure out whether it had any impact on student achievement. On the other hand, if you had a subset of your schools in your district that you put it into, and another set that you didn't, you may be able to see whether there's any contrasting information between the two sets of schools that indicates whether this program is in fact leading to higher student achievement that you desire. So the one obvious way is with any new program to think of phasing the introduction in over a year or 2 years or 3 years, convincing the schools that they'll eventually get it, but that, which is rightfully the case right now, you might not have funds to do it in all the schools in the initial year, but use that possibility to be able to evaluate programs. The idea of continuous improvement is basically sort of a no-brainer out the other end if you have the information. Expand the things that work and that seem to have an impact on student performance, and cut out the programs that are not leading to higher student performance. This idea of micro-evaluation and micro looks at what's working and what isn't, I think has much more promise than even trying to read the research literature and try to use the What Works Clearinghouse in Washington, D.C. and other places, because it's really tailored to your circumstances and what you're trying to do specifically, and it's a way that over time you can get information. Typically now we have lots of programs that are put into place once. They're not really effectively evaluated, so they stay in place until either somebody suggests a new program or somebody adds a new program on top of them. But that doesn't lead to any systematic improvement, frankly, and it leads to those answers that we had up at the beginning, where we've dramatically increased our spending without seeing a commensurate gain in achievement. So let me just wrap up now and see if I can answer your questions or speak about your concerns, some of which you have a lot more knowledge about some things than I do, and but if I have knowledge, I'll try to help you. So here, let me give you the conclusions quickly. The first conclusion is that in some sense, this is really God's work. There's nothing more important for the U.S. than ensuring that our children have the skills needed for the future. It turns out that the things that drive economic performance in the future are going to be the skills of the people, the human capital of our country. And that's what's led us to be at the top of the economic pyramid today, but also threatens us in the future because other countries are doing better than we are. Now, obviously, there's a lot of rigidities in the system. I mean, my interpretation of what we saw in Chicago over the last 2 weeks is the rigidities that you have to face. Lots of your people, including those that are organized by the local unions, don't want any change. They don't want to see new evaluations of teachers. They don't want to see any performance pay. They don't want to see making tough decisions about who's in the classroom and who isn't, or how we organize classrooms. This is something that I can't deal with, but that has to be dealt with nationally and locally if you're going to improve. To me, at an aggregate level, the potential gains for our children and for our nation justify substantial structural change. They justify bargaining that involves trade-offs of trying to convince people to go to new ways of evaluating programs and people versus potentially higher rewards. So you can think of different combinations of slightly larger class sizes with much larger rewards for good teachers that can be done even with the same budgets, even with Governor Cuomo's budgeting as you see it. Now, I want to offer a couple of cautions. The first caution is that lots of people argue for programs and different changes in policies on the basis of achievement, and you only get the gains here, the economic gains that I've laid out, if in fact you get the achievement gains. And this is where the continuous improvement and checking whether you're getting the gains are really important. And then finally, I would just sort of say, if you are inclined to throw up your hands and say, well, it's just too hard to get these changes, to me that means that you're willing to accept really large losses, particularly for our children in the next generations. We're going to be fine, and the U.S. economy is going to be fine and do well over the short run, but in the long run, the only thing that matters to the U.S. economy is basically the human capital of our people. And so that's my general spiel. Hopefully it hit on some things that are useful to you or important to think about. But let me answer any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you very much. If anyone has a question for Eric, please hit the raise hand button. You'll be placed into a queue, and then we'll go through one by one. Again, if you have a question, hit the raise hand button, and we'll go from there. I'll give you 10, 15 seconds to go ahead and do that, and we'll start with the first question. All right, Eric, we have a question from Barbara Smith. Barbara, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
I surely can, Barbara.
I was very interested in your information on the teacher effectiveness. So I guess I was just wondering, you know, is there a place where we can find additional research or additional articles that you've worked on this?
Sure. As a matter of fact, there's some articles on that, some simple to read ones that I will send to Matthew and he can distribute. You have email addresses, right? Let me I will forward a couple things to him to give you some background. As I say, what's happened is that there's been a lot of research on this area, and part of it's been controversial because it gets into questions about what's called value added of teachers and whether that should be used in evaluations of teachers, and that's part of the Chicago controversy and so forth. But I can give you the information on the overall ranges and research on that.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. And we have no other questions. Again, if you have a question for Eric, please hit raise hand, and we'll put you through. We'll give you another couple seconds to go ahead and do that.
While this is going on, let me just respond a little bit further to Barbara's question. Part of the sort of media publicity has been, should we use value-added measures of teachers to judge their effectiveness? There's all kinds of controversy about these and so forth. Most places that have started to use this, both at a state level or local level, have tried to use some information on student test scores through statistical models of value added, but use it as a portion of the evaluation of teachers. No teacher, to my knowledge, in any place in the U.S. is judged solely on value added. The most refined place of using these systems is Washington, D.C. Michelle Rhee, when she was superintendent in Washington, D.C., negotiated a contract with the union just as she was walking out the door, frankly, where there would be an evaluation of teachers that if value-added information was available, half of their evaluation would be based upon that. And the other half would be based upon evaluations of teachers by trained evaluators from outside the building. They were just purely trained evaluators. If that information on value added was not available for people who were not teaching in tested grades or tested subject matters, the entire evaluation would be based upon outside observers. It turns out that only 20% of the teachers in Washington, D.C. have acceptable value-added measures, and the rest use these other evaluations. But over time, if a teacher is in the top portion, the top quartile, I think it is, of the distribution of performance for 2 years in a row, that teacher can get an annual bonus in base pay put into their base pay of up to $25,000 added base pay. If a teacher is in the bottom group, in the completely ineffective group, for 2 years after attempts have been made to improve the teacher, that teacher is released. So about 1,000 teachers, I believe, have now gotten bonuses at the top end in Washington, D.C., and several hundred teachers at the bottom and have been released. Now this is still a program in process, and it's being refined all the time, but it is the kind of program that I think holds real promise for school systems. But it's not easy. I mean, it's obvious that Michelle Reed was in a locked battle with people whom you probably know from New York over the teacher contract. So I don't know if there's any other questions.
No, we have no other questions. This is going to be your last chance, everyone, to ask a question of Dr. Knuschik. So please hit the raise hand button, and we'll put you right through. Okay, we have no questions. Doc, thank you very much for presenting today, and thank you all for attending. If anyone would like a copy of the video that we made for this, please send me an email, and we'll send one right out to you. So thank you all very much.
Thanks so much for tuning in.
I'm glad to have you. Thank you.